QuitCast. My name is Becca. Today we are going to be talking about strengths and specifically a topic that came up in one of our Patreon topical calls, which is how do I make room, or how do I help people who don't have strengths that are like mine exist in the same place as me. We talk about this a lot when we discuss interpersonal relationships with strengths, where when I have something really high and then someone else has it low, we often don't understand each other. And the behaviors seem almost antithetical to what would be common sense to us, right? The high consistency who thinks it's completely antithetical to customize things and does not like customizing things, and then sees a high individualization customizing literally everything and gets frustrated with the fact that we're customizing everything, that there is no consistent rule, right? Like that is an understanding of my top 5 strengths and what is low for me, and I need to understand how to make room for everyone to exist, right? Like how do I help myself understand strengths that I don't have well, or strengths that don't make sense to me, so that I can relate well with people or have good friends that are not like me, or not think poorly of people who are just wired differently from me. How do we do that? And the question specifically came up in regard to how command works, because command is one of the least common strengths in the full 34 of the entire population. The command is in the bottom 5 in occurrence. I think something like 13%, 12 or 13% of the population has high command. And so it is less common, 1 in 10 people that only will have high command. And that's not a lot when you consider how small most people's circles are, right? So there's a likelihood you may not even know someone well who has command if you're not the command person in your circle. It's also very common for the yellow strengths in general, the influencing strengths, to be lower in occurrence with the general population. Influencing strengths are the least common type. And so we do talk a little bit more about those in particular in this talk show. Terry and I got together just to talk about, discuss what would look like what would making room for something look like. And I wanted to just do a quick intro to give you a sense for why we did that. Specifically, I think we are not, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the talk show, we are not trying to give blanket rules for how everyone should act in all situations. The understanding is that there's a closeness in the relationship and a desire to accommodate how another person is wired for success. This is definitely a very relational topic, which of course being, Terry and I are both have a lot of blue strengths, relationship building strengths in our top. So it's no surprise that this came up in a discussion. And so I do want to caveat that just at the very beginning and say thank you for everyone who participated in that call. And without further ado, let's talk about making room for strengths. Take it away, Terry and Becca. Well, the comment came up. So we were having a Patreon call and somebody had asked a question about command. In like one of the questions was about command. And I had said, well, sometimes you have to make space for command. And everybody was like, wait a minute, what does that mean? Like, what does it look like to make space for command? And so I asked some of the command people to answer, like, what would it look like? At like, what is the most frustrating part about having command, right? And one of the comments that I thought was like encapsulated it really well was that feeling of being dismissed as a high command because I am not sensitive enough. So like everything I say is just automatically dismissed because I wasn't sensitive enough when I wasn't trying to be insensitive. So like there's a difference between the people who are like clearly trying to be insensitive and people who are just trying to be clear and precise, which is what command is all about, right? Like it's about clarity. And so that comment had all the empathy people going, oh, honey, like, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Well,
Which
there's a difference.
Right.
There's a difference too, right? When it's on, like even because
Yeah.
so command and like my restorative feels this way a lot, and a lot of people that and analytical can feel this way. Like even when my restorative's on and I'm in it, that's it. I'm in it. I'm going there and I'm
Yes.
this way. Command is that way as well. But after the
Yeah.
fact, we feel bad. We feel like people didn't understand us or they didn't get the spirit of which we were trying to, I'll point out issues to help a person because obviously if they're bringing this up, they can't see the obvious problem and I have to help them. And I'm going to get a little passionate that way. But yeah, so even making space within yourself is an important thing, right? Because we beat ourselves up. And I've talked to command people that do the same thing. But when they're in it, they're not thinking of that. They're there to fix a problem or to help someone or to take charge.
I mean, I always have to this is why we don't talk about this a lot,
Yeah.
right? Is because I always have to caveat this discussion with what I do not mean is that everyone with command has the right to walk over everyone regardless of what they feel. That's not what I mean.
Right.
This is primarily about, and actually the way that Terry and I were talking about this originally came up about relationships. It was father son or parent child, it was spouse spouse or partner partner, um it was relational, like when relationally there is something important to you about that person, that when you make space for their strengths, what it looks like is I don't just acknowledge that they are that way and then treat them in a different way than the way that they are. I allow them to be that way and then I am appreciative that they are different from me, and I treat them in a way that's different from the way I might treat myself, for instance. Like, to me, the reason we don't have this conversation a lot is because it can come across as sounding to people like I'm saying, just let them be jerks.
Correct.
Just let
Right. And
anyone who says anything to you, it must be command. So you have to just let them be command.
right.
Oh, no, no, no. That's not what I'm saying. So in this particular call, like, this is a community of people. We've been building a community
Yeah.
together that's all about allowing people to be the way that they are and trying to understand first before we judge. So
Right.
that's what the whole point is, right? So, like, in that moment, those command people felt really vulnerable to be able to say, hey, sometimes it really hurts when people dismiss what I have to say because I'm not coming across as being empathetic,
Right. It's not
right?
advocating or defending certain types of behavior. It's
Right.
it's more the way I see that behavior might not be the way that person is intending the
Yes.
behavior to be.
Yes.
That to me, that's the big thing is that we always live in our own bodies and we judge experiences from our life experiences so far. And
Yes.
it does often happen where a person will, I know I've been taught in my life that when a person acts a certain way, they usually have always meant this. But when I meet a stranger, that might not be the case. And since I've learn more, well, and that's why I always love to learn about people, and I always give them that, where might this be coming from? But again, that's some of the strengths that I have. But yeah, it's the realization, I think, is the point here is that it may be coming from a different place, and if it
Yes.
is bad behavior or if it is rudeness, of course we never advocate accepting that at all.
No.
But
No.
often I think that's what came up in your call was is that those people were saying that they didn't even realize that's what they were doing in their
Yes.
mind. That was not their intention at
Yes.
all. Yeah.
Well, because the key first part, right, is there has to be a relationship of some kind. Like, there has to be a willingness to for both of us to be vulnerable. It can't just, this is why I say, like, we caveat this at the beginning with, this is why we don't talk about it a lot, because I don't want it to come across as just let people do whatever they want to you. It doesn't
Right.
matter.
Right.
The key in a discussion like this is always there has to be vulnerability on both sides of the equation. So, like, if it's a leader always asking you to let them be the way that they want, but they never make the same concessions for you, that's a very different conversation. If it's a relationship where it's clear that the person is only self-interested and not others interested, I would not have the same advice. But so let's talk about, though, if we make the very first assumption that you are in some kind of a relating ship, like relationship, platonic, romantic, it doesn't matter, but some kind of a relationship where both parties are going to be vulnerable with each other on some level. What does making space look like? Right. And so the first key is you have to be willing to be wrong about your assumption about why someone does something.
Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions.
you you can't help but make assumptions about people's behavior. It's going to
Of
happen.
course.
When you make an assumption about something, even if it's based on what you feel is really solid evidence, or even if it's based on like, and we see this happen even in strengths relationships, right? Where it's like, oh, well, command is always this, or harmony is always this, or empathy is always this. And it's like, wait a minute, what is that person's individual? And I think this is the second part. Like, so the first part is you have to be willing to be wrong. That is really, really important. And you have to be willing to believe that they are correct when they say what they say. Like, so if someone says, I don't mean to be offensive, I can't assume that they actually do just because I think their manner's offensive. Like, as a high command, how do we make space for that? Right. But the reason, again, assuming vulnerability on both sides, assuming both people are equally invested in the relationship, what it looks like to make space for that is someone says, as a high restorative, you're doing that wrong. Can you not do that that way? Which is, common for restorative, right? To be aware of the problem. And as a low restorative, what I immediately assume about that is that you really like pointing out that when things are wrong, and you get some kind of a high out of saying that's wrong or bad, because that is what I believe is true about people who say that. That is not necessarily because that's what that person feels, right? So the piece about like being willing to be wrong, and then the second part of like being willing to believe that they're trying to be helpful, like you have to suspend those parts of yourself that is really committed to you being right about something. Like that's
Yeah.
kind of the bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and there is no set in stone way, right? This is, and again, probably why we don't talk about this often. This is because often
Right.
people want
It's
do
so
this,
it
and it always is
depends-y.
that, but it's always
Yep.
it's this is not a, there's no recipe for it to work every time. But I
Yep.
like the making room part, because the making room is to at least say we're taking a pause to consider if what we were assuming may not be correct, and
Yeah.
it's worth exploring a little bit to see if it is. And that's definitely always good in communication with people, especially people that you care about on some level, or if you have to work with them, if you're, whatever the circumstances are. So yeah, and again, like the commercial I always seem to be, just understanding that it might come from specific traits about that person that I don't share,
Yes.
can be a very empowering thing. It gives us that neutral ground to talk with, right? Instead
Yep.
of attack and defend, it's, we can both approach this from a neutral position, which is less threatening. And of course, there's that, conversation, crucial conversations and stuff. This helps
Right.
get people to, the stakes aren't as high. There's a place where we can hear each other and understand each
Yep.
other, and that's the key, definitely.
Yeah. The third part that I just keep thinking is so important is that I really have to be willing to understand things from their point of view. Like I have to be willing to step behind their eyes and hear and listen to what it feels like to be them. And so some of that, what Terry was talking about like learning about the strengths and testing everybody and seeing what everyone's traits are. When we were having this conversation earlier, one of the things I said is like, I always have to be really cautious when people are like, I want to know what my husband's strengths are, my wife's strengths are, so that I can make them do this thing, or so that I can make them understand why this is wrong about them or why they shouldn't be this way. And I'm always like, oh, but that's the opposite reason of why strengths are helpful. Because what you usually assume to be true is not actually true about them,
Mm.
especially when it comes to like the way that spouses are differently wired from each other, or opposition or opposite wired from each other, means that you're likely to pick your opposite on some level and then have traits that they don't understand, and they have traits you don't understand. And so being willing to see it from behind their eyes and see how they might be feeling when they or thinking when they use that particular talent is so important.
It's interesting too, right? Because if you have that thought, that initial thought, that's what you were leading with. You may very well be, and we see this often, the same people that have that saying about someone else, that's how they approach their own self-development with their own talents. And it's a harder path to understanding yourself. And when you're looking for what's wrong, even with yourself, and trying to get rid of it or not liking it or something. So what you just described of how to approach someone else is a great way to approach ourselves. And that's what's right with my strengths. Which strengths do I need to talk to? How can I accept that? Because we either get people say, well, I don't like this strength, or it's not comfortable for me and I don't want it, or I wish I had a different one, versus oh, this is me. Now that I understand it better, I accept it, I can help implement it. So it's an extension of that self-development, extends to how you
Well,
would
and
approach other people as well.
yeah, that's even a good point about like the way that I approach coaching. It just you saying that reminds me the way that I was early on with my coaching. I had a really hard time when people would down talk their strengths, like when they would be, and I would try to be like, oh my gosh, but look at this. Isn't it so cool? Isn't it so cool? And so often it was like I would miss that it was a restorative or a command or a deliberative or a responsibility or a
They didn't
belief
see it as negative
that,
like you thought they
right.
were seeing it. Yeah.
Well, not just that, but it was that thinking of it negatively actually helps them,
Mm.
like competition, right? Competition is famously, things should be painful, like it should hurt if it's working. And so when I'm the person who's like, no, 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 this like strategic, right? If it's not working, don't do it. Like that's always the strategic or not mantra. It's always the strategic slogan. If it's not working, don't do it. Why would we ever be spending time doing things that are that painful, right? So as a lower competition person, I do not have high competition. I had to learn how competition sounds in coaching calls, and I had to learn how to coach competition better, because the way that I was coaching competition, especially at the very, very beginning, was I was coaching it like significance, which is not how you coach competition. And so, even just the journey that I went through my own self, I see that the most easy thing to do when learning about strengths or when seeing other people's strengths is to treat them the way I would want to be treated and to make assumptions about why behavior is happening. So I really have to be conscious about, am I willing to be wrong about the motivation and what I assume is true about the motivation? Am I willing to believe them from their perspective? And then honestly, like, can I listen to them to see it from their point of view? That's how you make space. The reason that we initially had this conversation was because we were talking about specific examples of how like an individual person had made space for or might make space for a particular strength.
Right.
And I was noticing that over the friendship that Terry and I have had, because I am very low restorative, bottom 5 restorative. It is one of the hardest strengths for me to understand. And when restorative really takes off and kind of is like restorative in all of its
It's hard to
glory,
spot. It's pretty hard to spot.
it freaks me out.
It does.
Like
It
it
does freak
it
you out.
it really freaks me out. And what I've been learning about restorative is I really have been learning to enjoy watching it happen so that I don't take on my expectations of what I would be feeling if I were experiencing that, right? Like I need to be willing to see it from behind Terry's perspective, because what was so fascinating about restorative, if you see it done the way that I think is most beneficial, is that restorative, when it sees the problem and can see the solution and fixes it, is very happy when the problem is fixed and done. And when it can't fix the problem, then it doesn't look at the problem, or it has those momentary bursts, right? Where Terry will
Right.
be like, oh my God, this thing, and then just has that moment, but then he feels better on the other side. Can
Yeah.
you explain what that is like internally?
No. On video, I can't. I remember
Not on
I
me.
said it to you. I said, here's a little, so I think it was a couple weeks ago. I told you about how I was going to write a chapter before the end of the day. And I spent an hour and 23 minutes working on this chapter. And that will tip you off that there was a problem when I can tell you that I spent an hour and 23 minutes specifically. And at the end of an hour and 23 minutes, I had written one sentence and it was still not right. And so you said, what? Why would you do that? And I said, well, I knew right off the bat it wasn't going to be very good. And you said, but you spent an hour and 23 minutes doing that. Why? What's the point? And I said, because after about 2 or 3 minutes, I started to get pretty angry and I let the sweet, sweet embrace of restorative rage grabbed me and hugged me. And then I was just angry for the next hour and 23 minutes. And you said, well, why would you do that? But my restorative kind of liked that. It wasn't a bad thing. Now, it might not have been something that you'd want to be around me for. And that is something that happens with restorative, but it's okay. It needs, that's its outlet, right? For me to hold that in or not be able to vent sometimes
Yes.
is the
Oh my
hard
gosh.
thing. And so again, yeah,
Yes.
knowing that, and there's other strengths, and what I'm like you, the ones that I don't have that are the furthest down fascinate me the most, and I'm in a learning mindset when I coach these people, and thankfully some very sweet people coach with me regularly, and I thank them for
Right. Because
sharing their
that's
stuff
how you
because I
learn.
get to
I mean,
learn it so much. Yeah.
that's
But
how you learn. Like,
yeah,
I'll be honest, I I will sometimes provoke Terry's restorative a little bit because I can tell that
because it's
it
so hard to
needs,
do. This is so
right.
hard to do.
I can tell that it needs the outlet. And I'll just be like, oh my gosh, this thing is so annoying and awful. And I'll just post about it. And then it'll just be like a diatribe, or like I'll mention something when we're on the phone. It'll just be a diatribe. And I think, like, before, because my significance is so performance oriented, it acts a lot like Achiever sometimes. Before, whenever there would be a problem, I would be like, well, if I don't fix this, it's not going to be okay, right? Like that woo feeling, right? Like we all need to be okay. Why is this not okay? And now I know it is actually okay when you're doing that. Like, there's
Yeah,
nothing that isn't okay. You're going to
yeah,
take care of it yourself. It's going to be fine. We'll all
yeah,
be okay.
yeah.
And so I actually enjoy now listening to the restorative rants in a way that I couldn't before, because I kept trying to fix the restorative. But what
Right.
Terry said there was so important. Like, if you, as a restorative, if you hold that in, it will eat you from the inside.
Yeah.
So, like, you have to have people around you who will make space, or you can just do it on your own. Like, that's fine as well. But like, people around you who will make space for uh, the way that your strength in particular will act. But the learning curve piece is being okay with the failure
Right.
sometimes,
Right.
right? Like, being willing to
Right.
see that I did something wrong for your restorative, and how do I do
Yeah.
it right next
Yeah.
time?
I think
Right.
too, you just brought up something that I think is interesting, that as you become more comfortable with this language and knowing all of the names and the definitions, and as you become more confident and comfortable in yourself, you always see that with people who are experienced in something versus people who aren't in anything. There's this calmness of others, a presence of more of a tolerance and an ability. And I think that's a really interesting thing as well. You've been doing this for so many years. Thanks to you, I've been doing this now for years. And there's this comfortableness that then goes back outwards. And so if you're listening to this right now, you learning your own ways and how you are, then you're less apt to take it personally, because often when we're meeting people who are getting to know themselves, they say, this makes me do this and I don't know why. And Becca just used a great example. She realized it was her strengths, some of her strengths, that were having an issue with it by what they wanted to do. And by knowing that about herself, she could alleviate that pressure and then be more in the moment and let me be me, or your spouse be your spouse, or your kid be your kid. And it comes, so that's another great way to make spaces to actually be more comfortable and learn who you are and how you work as
Yeah.
well. I think that's
Because that's
a
the
great
other
example.
piece, right, about the command conversation, is that what often happens with command and empathy is that the easiest thing in the world for empathy to do is to think about how other people will feel when I say something.
Mm,
So when Terry or Crystal or some of our higher empathy coaches are anticipating what people might be feeling, it's literally the easiest thing that they could possibly do.
Yeah.
So when you have a lower empathy, which is really more of what we were talking about in that particular moment, it was less of a high command thing. It was more of a lower empathy thing.
Right.
Because
Right.
I also am this way sometimes, where when I don't know that someone is not being sympathetic, does that make sense?
Right.
Like it's
Right.
very quick and easy for me to jump in and judge if the easiest thing I do is think about what other people will feel when I say something. Then it's very easy for me to jump in and judge when someone else is not capable of doing that and to get angry that they didn't do that thing that feels so easy for me to do.
Right. Well, because often we always have this belief, right? If I can do it, anyone should be able to do it. I'm not
Yes.
asking for anything hard here, but the truth is that we've learned is that's
QTP.
actually not true. The
Yes.
things you can do are the magic. They're the things that most others can't do. And
Yes.
that is
If
very,
we
and that's a
could
good
really
realization.
just, if we could internalize that, like I now start off my productivity myths talk with that exact phrase. The very first myth that we believe that is damaging us is if I can do it, anyone can do it. That is the most damaging thing that we believe is true. And it's not just about productivity, it's about everything. Because when
Mhm.
I judge someone for not Googling something as a number one input,
Okay.
the
Can
sheer
yeah.
bitchiness of that comment, and again, I'm speaking for myself, I can feel myself
Mm.
judging them for not Googling stuff.
Yeah.
And then I have a friend who's a number 34 learner. And now I feel differently about people who don't immediately go and Google stuff, because when he and I had that conversation about what it's like to be a 34 learner, and I was like, wow, that is so the opposite of how I am. I'm never going to judge people for not Googling stuff again. I need to know that what's the easiest for me is the hardest for someone else.
I don't feel so bad when I can't do things that other people can do as well. And we do, a lot of us do. How come it's so easy for them? What's wrong with me? I'm like, they're obviously really, really good at it, and I'm not. So I'm going to become friends with them and try to learn. But again, there's a lot of stuff I'll never be good at, right? I think you and I share that belief that they say everyone can do anything they want. I don't believe that. I
That's
believe you have a
such a
certain
lie.
set of skills and that's it. And you make the most of that. And I think that we'd all be happier if we realized that. But that was, yeah,
Yeah.
that it goes both ways for
And I'll
sure.
be like super serious. I think there are people who say that, like people who say, "Oh, anyone can do anything," and what they really mean is it's still worth trying to do something, or like
Sure.
you should be able to hope for what you
Right.
really want to dream or whatever. But
Yeah.
then there are people who legitimately do not accept it when people are not capable on the level that they are capable. And
Which
that
goes
to
back
me
to
is like, again,
that first, if I can do it, anyone can do it thing, right?
right,
That's
like
the,
you
yeah.
failed the first expectation, which is you have to be willing to be wrong all the time.
Yeah.
Willing to be wrong. And if you are not willing to be wrong, like that is the least growth mindset
Mhm.
ever that I've ever heard.
Yeah.
The not willing to be wrong
And that
mindset.
comes from a skill set as well, that and that can,
Right, right.
that really
Because of
does.
course,
Yeah.
you're right. Even as I'm saying that, I'm like, well, but I can imagine there are some strengths. Right.
A
But
hundred
here's what
percent.
I
Yeah.
do though. Because what I don't mean is you should be willing to believe that you are actually wrong about everything.
Right. That's
What I
not good.
mean is that you
Yes.
have to be willing to entertain the possibility that you have read something
Mm.
incorrectly, particularly about human behavior. And
Yeah.
especially because it's often the people who don't know anything about human behavior who are
Right.
saying things like, well, this is why they did it. Like, that's
Yeah.
clearly why they did that thing.
A great thing that I always think about when I think of that particular truth is different new editions of translations, right? There's so I always say I wish that I could read and understand, because I couldn't understand it, the original first print of Alice in Wonderland, because I know that as the language changes each year, someone takes this word and
Or the
adapts it to the new
Canterbury
the slang,
Tales,
and that,
or
yeah, or
mhm,
the Velveteen Rabbit actually. There's
yeah,
a couple of them that I think have deeper meanings that are lost. And so,
or
yeah,
the
and
Iliad or the
but
Bible
right,
or
but
yep.
100% that. But we definitely, each edition, and I mean, people aren't even be able to understand some of the things we learned as kids now, because now they're like, I have to ask kids what emojis mean. I don't know which one is used properly. So it always changes.
Yeah.
But that those are great examples of how the truth is that really things are interpreted differently by different people, and being open and willing to come from a place of understanding. I
Yeah.
think that's what this is all really about, is being open to understanding stuff deeper,
Yeah.
and to go forward.
Which, of course, as I'm saying this, and as we are both saying this,
Couldn't be more learner if we tried.
yes, I fully recognize that we are both learner and individualization, and that Terry's empathy and I'm significant. So, like, I am
Yeah.
100%. But that's also why when I say you should QTP
Mm.
everyone, including Becca, because if
Yes.
Becca doesn't resonate for you, then you shouldn't be listening to me. I really mean that,
Yep.
because there are people for whom the message of strength is so antithetical to the
Mm-hmm.
way that they believe
Yep.
that they will vitriolically attack me for saying what I say.
I find that comforting, actually, when I run into someone who is vehemently against certain things. And I'll
Yeah.
sometimes go to those people because I know that they will not always agree with me, and they may have a counterpoint that I hadn't thought of. It may
Yeah.
be that. So yeah, I do find that comforting. But still, you're right. That is a great example of making space. And again, the nuances of it are, you could go on and on forever about it. And but hopefully this conversation brings up that point and the thought of seeing it from a different light and a different angle. Yeah.
So, as we consider action points for what we just heard about, I want to circle all the way back around to the goal is to work on our primary relationships first. Like those are the places that we want to really work on making room for, not to make room for random people and things like that, because that will come later, right? As you get to know the strengths better and better, that will come later. I'm 16 or something years into this journey, almost 17, and I'm still learning so much about how to make room for other strengths, because it's how do I come into contact with those, and how do I wrestle through what that looks like. So, when I make room for other strengths, I want to start close first. So start with, look at the people around you. Who are the people that you understand the least, or who have behaviors that don't make sense to you or might even frustrate you? Can you look at their behavior through the lens of their strengths and look for a way that they might be doing something that is a success pattern that's good, that is just not high for you, something that you don't necessarily value or think of first? It's not common sense to you, right? It's not an instinct. So look at your bottom five and look at their top five. And obviously, if they haven't taken the test yet, offer to have them take the test, because that's definitely, like we always encourage, if you are invested in having better relationships, having a better career, having a better marriage, having a better whatever, then you want to invest in those strengths that you have. And that means investing in other people and knowing the people around you and how they are wired, and especially the people closest to you. So if you haven't yet had an opportunity to get the people around you to take the test, definitely try that. Of course, we always say, because there are people who the strengths is just not their thing, they're never going to be that person. If they're giving you significant pushback, it's for another time, right? Like you can ask someone in the strengths Facebook group or in the Better Faster Writers Facebook group, just to see if there is a reason why a behavior like that might be coming from a place of strength, rather than what I'm assuming it's coming from if I would be doing it. Because, like we talked about in the show, that's usually wrong. Like my assumption about someone's behavior is usually wrong because I'm not looking at it through their lens. And so I just want to encourage people, as we're looking at our closest relationships. And again, like I'm going to encourage you, I'm primarily talking about friendships, partnerships, work relationships, like close relationships where each person is equally vulnerable and each person has something at stake. This is not an indication of how we should treat the general population and always be excusing people's behavior just because they might have different strengths from us. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a seek to understand. mentality in relationships, which we do find transforms relationships. Seek to understand, seek to know rather than to assume. And so the first place to start is the test. If you haven't done that yet, please do. You can reach out to manager at betterfasteracademy.com and we can sell you codes for the test, or you can go to gallup.com and buy the codes for the assessment yourself directly from Gallup. We sell the same test that they give. And so that's the first place to start. The second place is, once you know their top five, look for the places where your top five and their top five are different. That's the first thing. And then you want to look at the strengths that they have that you don't have, especially if the ones you don't have in your top five happen to be in your bottom five, which happens a lot, or your bottom 10. And then I want you to go to the videos, either ours or Gallup's, and I want you to look at what might that strength sound like from someone that I trust that's coming from a good place, or I trust it's coming from a success pattern rather than my assumptions about how I have thought it might be presenting. And I want to walk through the process that we talked about, right? I want to suspend my assumptions, know that I might be wrong about what my assumptions are, and then seek to understand, right? Like that is just so key, seek to understand. So hopefully this video has been helpful. We will likely be doing more conversations like this in the future, sort of the practical, like now that we've talked a lot about strengths over the last 3+ years, uh, we want to talk about a little more practical things when it comes to how to act out strengths in your relationships and your work and things like that. So let us go from here. Your homework, should you choose to accept it, is to start looking for ways to make room for other strengths in your immediate relationships. As always, if you need coaching, you can come to our Patreon, patreon.com/Becca Syme. And that Patreon will get you access to our coaches and all kinds of resources as well on there. And I hope that you will avail yourself of coaching if you need it. We do partnership coaching, we do couples coaching, we do team coaching for work teams or work relationships, friend relationships, whatever you need. We do all of that. So if you need any of it, whether you're a writer or not, we encourage you to avail yourself of that. And again, patreon.com/Becca Syme, or the Better Faster website, which is betterfasteracademy.com. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and we will see you next time on the QuitCast. All right. Bye, everybody.